Okay, here we go. Trying to understand the whole Bible in a year. I think we might be getting there. We'll see. So anyway, we are now finished with another section or another category of the scriptures. And the section that we just completed is known as the poetry and wisdom books. And those books are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, love song. And so those five compose what we call the wisdom books and the poetry books. And they're called poetry because they're in poetic fashion. So good enough. So we've gone through those, but we're going to now just look at the overview of the whole Bible, because we're going to go into a new section. We're going to go into the section of the prophets. And it's going to be a little bit difficult to work out where these prophets belong. And we're going to confuse it even more because we're going to try to show some of the chronology of these prophets, the chronological order that they go in. Because the way that they're laid out in the scripture is not chronological, it's not historic. So they actually put them into two categories called the major and the minor prophets. And the major and the minor prophets mean that the minor prophets are just the shorter books and the major prophets are the bigger ones. Well, that's going to create a problem for us when we're trying to go through it chronologically and figure out where everything belongs. So the sections of the Bible. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. So there you go. And there are probably 5 sections in the Old Testament, or 5 categories, and probably 4 categories or 5 categories in the New. So what are those categories? Well, if we were to categorize them, and you have to look at each one of these books as a scroll, because that's how they were originally. They were scrolls. And so get the picture of 66 scrolls all rolled up, and then we could color code them and put them in certain areas. And the first place that we would color code them is the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch. Okay, fair enough. Pentateuch 5. Oh, yes, but those first 5 books are also known as the Torah. All right, it's got 2 names. Well, it's also known as the Law. Oh, all right, it's 3 names. Oh, then also known as the Law of Moses. Oh, okay, which one is it? And then sometimes even just referred to as Moses. So those books, those 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Law of Moses, the Book of the Law. So there's those 5 books. What are they? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Fair enough. So then we get into what are known as the historical books. And the historical books follow on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And it starts with the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Chapter 12 of Genesis, we find the family of Abraham. The book of Genesis becomes the story of Abraham's family. In fact, the Old Testament is the story of the family of Abraham, later known as the nation of Israel. And the New Testament is about the man that came from Abraham, the Messiah, Jesus. So there's the Pentateuch, section number 1. Section number 2, there's 12 of these books, and these are called historical books. And these historical books take us from the end of the book of Exodus, when they exited Egypt as slaves, and they were moving towards the promised land. And so one of those books tells us about the journeys of, actually it's Numbers in the Pentateuch that tells us about the journeys, and then the history books tell us about them actually going into the promised land. And so the first history book is Joshua, and Joshua leads them into the promised land, and he gives the promised land to them, divides it up into 12 territories for the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's these little half tribes, and it gets a little bit confusing, but for the most part, that's how it works, and they go in there. And then the book of Judges, it takes about 400 years of them settling into the land with no king, just having God as their king, just having God as their ruler. And it's about what happens when they're not serving the Lord. When they're not serving the Lord, things go terrible, and they cry out to the Lord, and the Lord rescues them, and they do good, and then they do it all over again. So there's those historical books. There's the book of Judges, the book of Joshua, the book of Judges. And then you get into a new period where it starts to change, where it's sort of the leadership of the prophets and the kings. And that would be 1st and 2nd Samuel. We find being sort of led by prophets. And then we find that they ask for a king, and they get King Saul, and then they get God's king David. Well, God didn't want them to have a king at all, but he gives them David, and David's a good king. And then we get into Solomon. Then we get into 1st and 2nd Kings, and by the time we're there, there's a civil war, and they're divided. They're a divided nation. There's a northern kingdom, and there's a southern kingdom. And the divided kingdom gets pretty confusing when you're reading through 1st and 2nd Kings, because you're reading about the kings of the north and the kings of the south at the same time. So it can get very, very confusing. And then we get into the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which simply chronicle the lives of the kings, but they chronicle the life of the good kings, the southern kings. And they did pretty good for the most part, but each one of them, did a little bit not so good as the last, and it's just this sort of slow decline, this slow moving decline. And then that brought us into what we had just finished, which are known as the wisdom books and the poetry books. And what we're moving into is the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so we'll be looking at those prophets, and you have them as well, and we're going to try to fit them in where they go chronologically. And then we will go, and then there is, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's a section in my Bible. It's actually just a page of white. There's nothing there. And those are known as the 400 silent years. So between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's 400 years where there's no written scripture, no written prophecy. There's some things that happen, and there's some stories that happen, and those are recorded for us historically. And some Bibles will actually even include some of those historical things, like the time of the Maccabees, cleansing the temple. But most don't, and it's not really accepted as scripture, accepted as inspiring books, and accepted as being relatively true, but not being accepted as scripture. So in between the two, you have 400 years, and then you come into the New Testament. As soon as you come into the New Testament, there's just an explosion of miracles and supernatural activity. Fulfillment of the prophets. All these prophecies are being fulfilled. Miracles are happening. Angels are showing up. The Messiah is coming in, and boy, it's just he comes in with a bang. He just comes in with all this supernatural activity. And then you have the 4 Gospels, which we would call those biography, or maybe you would call them history. But it's the account of Jesus. And you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 different Gospels. We don't want to talk too much about that because we'll get into it later. And then followed by that is a book of history, the book of Acts, which takes, somewhere around 30 years, maybe 33 years, to go from start to finish. And it's the story of the early church, the church that was born on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Spirit is poured out on the day of Pentecost, the church is born. And we have the story of what they did and where they went in the book of Acts. And then you get into what's called letters or epistles, and you have the epistles of Peter and Paul, and they're writing to the church, trying to help the church straighten out and get their feet on the ground and know what it is that they believe and what it is that they're supposed to be doing, because they didn't really have any background. They're not Jewish, they're Gentiles, they're non-Jewish people. And so you have those, and then you have what is called general epistles, just other people that have written them. And then finally you get to the end, the book of Revelation, you get another book of prophecy. And the book of Revelation contains an awful lot of the Old Testament, And so, because it's been prophesied all along, and then Revelation is all about, the rescuing of God and then bringing us into eternity. So there we have it. We're going to be moving into the prophets and trying to follow along with the prophets. And so I hope that this one sort of sets us up for that. But we'll be doing a whole new section, the section of the Old Testament prophets. I think you're going to love it. Hey, bless you guys.